Why? I said wake up, motherfucker.
Heyo, Ian here for Sleep Deprivation, the big SD, back with more World of Warcraft content. And today I want to talk about the lack of ranged DPS that seem to be out there. I mean, our raid group only has 4 ranged DPS, and we have 9 melee. And the only reason we have 4 ranged is because we made one of our healers switch to ranged, and one of our melee switch to ranged. And we've had more in the past, but the problem is that we're always trying to recruit more ranged because we have so many melee. And it got me thinking, why are there so many melee and why are there so few ranged? Why are ranged rare? And I've come up with an answer, and that's what I'm going to go over here today. Now, for starters, it all comes down to the classes available to both roles. For ranged DPS, you have hunters, priests, shamans, mages, warlocks, and druids. So only 6 classes, but for melee on the other hand, there's warriors, paladins, hunters, rogues, shamans, monks, druids, demon hunters, and death knights. So yeah, a lot of options, but unfortunately, there's 9 melee and only 6 ranged. And it gets worse than that, because the fact of the matter is that, yeah, there's 1.5 times as many melee options as ranged, so you think, okay, plain and simple, that's an easy answer. More melee options means there's going to be more melee. But it's more complicated than that. Because the fact of the matter is there's a lot of people now that tend to prefer hybrid classes because they provide more options. For those of you who don't know, a hybrid is someone that can be more than just DPS. And unfortunately, 3 of the ranged DPS classes, the Hunter, the Mage, and the Warlock, are all purely DPS classes. That means they do nothing but DPS. And the advantage of a hybrid is quite expansive. It goes beyond just being able to do another role if you need to. The fact of the matter is that, yes, it's nice to be able to help out if you're down a healer or if you're down a tank. But on the flip side of things, it helps you get into more groups that may not have a spot for a DPS, and it helps you do things like dungeon queues and raid finder queues. Having to wait for a DPS queue is a nightmare, and being able to get in as a tank or healer is nice and easy. So 3 out of the 6 are pure DPS, which leaves only druids and I'm losing my mind here, druids, shamans, and priests for ranged DPS as the options that are hybrids, which is half. Meanwhile, melee hybrids have warriors, paladins, shamans, monks, druids, demon hunters, and death knights. All of those are hybrids. In fact, the only non-hybrids for melee are hunters and rogues. So there are 7 different hybrid options for melee, which is now making melee seem even more desirable. But it gets worse than that. Let's say you're a DPS, but you also want to tank. If you're ranged, you have one option. That's druid. If you want to be a ranged DPS and tank, druid is your only option. The only other hybrids are shaman and priest, which are healers and ranged. And yes, I get what you might be thinking. It makes more sense with tanking being essentially a melee role that melee DPS would be the other option. And as a result, every class that can tank can also do melee DPS. So therefore, it makes sense if, melee had fewer healing options. But melee DPS have more healing options than ranged. As ranged, you're once again limited to druid, priest, and shaman. But as a melee, you have druid, monk, paladin, and shaman. You have 4 different healing options. So the fact of the matter is there's just more options available for melee when it comes to hybrid classes, when it comes to available class options. They are having so many more options, but that's, once again, not where it stops. As a melee DPS, you have yet another advantage, because a hybrid that can be either a healer or a tank is okay, but a hybrid that can be both a healer, a tank, and the DPS that you want to be, that's a pretty big deal. And once again, for ranged, that's only druid. But for melee, druids, monks and paladins can be tanks, healers, and melee DPS. And I think I said both, that is the wrong word. But there's all these options, once again, for melee that don't exist for range. And with that being the case, it's pretty damn obvious why there's so many melee and so few range. You have all these options as melee. You have all these things pulling you in the direction of wanting to play melee, and not as many options when it comes to being ranged. And there's one last little thing that I want to throw out there that is unfortunately another advantage for melee and not that of range. We're going to take a look at priests. Priests can technically be ranged DPS, and I have a Shadow Priest, so I'm going to be a little bit of an exempt to this. But if you haven't noticed, there's probably not a lot of Shadow Priests out there. You'll see a lot more of every other type of ranged DPS than you will of Shadow Priests. And you might be wondering, why is that? So I've gone ahead and logged on to my Shadow Priest to make it easier to explain why they have so many disadvantages over other classes when it comes to ranged DPS. First of all, they are easily the least mobile DPS when it comes to ranged, which makes it hard for them to do DPS when there's a lot of movement in fights, because their main single target spell that they're going to be spamming a lot is Mind Flay. And yes, they're wanting to do more damage with Mind Blast and their dots, but it's a channeled ability. And when you're channeling that, it makes it very difficult to maintain that if you're having to move a lot. And it also sucks because if you're trying to maintain your insanity while in void form and you're moving, your insanity is going to drop a lot faster, which makes your DPS drop even more. And their main AoE spell is Mind Seer, which is once again also a channeled ability. Then they're also not very good at burst DPS. Let's say, like, they don't have any major burst DPS cooldowns to allow them to burst really quickly, and if you have to target swap and kill something quickly, like let's say it's only going to live 10 seconds, a lot of Shadow Priest damage comes from their damage over time abilities with Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch. So as a result, if the dots aren't going to last the whole duration, and if they're not in void form, then they're doing even less damage, which makes it very difficult for them to swap and kill an ad real quick. Makes it difficult for them to do damage on the move. But it gets even worse. They don't have a consistent CC like priests, sorry, not like priests, like mages, hunters, and shamans. They all have sheep, trap, and hex. They don't have heroism or bloodlust like mages, hunters, and shamans. They don't have a battle res like warlocks or druids. They don't have health stones like warlocks. They don't have an ability to give innervate like druids. And their interrupt is on a very long cooldown, with silence being 45 seconds, whereas other classes have much shorter cooldowns as well. So they have DPS limitations, and they have not a lot of utility to them as well. And the only real bigger utility they have is in the form of Mass Dispel, which is a very specific form of utility, and Power Word Fortitude, which odds are, with priests being having 2 different healing specializations and there only being 5 different healers of the game, there's a good chance you probably already have a priest in your raid group. So you're probably even not going to need this. And it's not a big enough deal to make it worth taking over other range. So yes, they can still do well. As I said, I play a Shadow Priest, therefore I think they are fun. But not as many people are interested in a Shadow Priest because consistently, up until recently, they've had weak DPS, and they just don't have the utilities of other classes out there when it comes to ranged DPS. So when you factor in the fact that priests are not really fully desirable in regards to being compared to other ranged DPS, okay, ranged DPS have 6 classes, but it's more like 5.5. And they only have 3 hybrids, but it's more like 2.5 because Shadow Priests aren't that desirable. So there's just not enough ranged DPS options to make it worth, well, not to make it worth, but to make it equal for the number of ranged DPS out there versus melee. And The only solution, unfortunately, for this is going to be if Blizzard adds more classes in the future, if they add classes that do ranged and not melee DPS. Because at the time right now, there's just not enough options for ranged and too many good options for melee. So that's the answer right there. If you're ever wondering why there's so many melee or why you can't find enough ranged, there you have it. There's just not enough ranged options and too many melee options. And it's unfortunate because you can't really get by in a raid group with just melee. And there are a lot of mechanics that favor ranged over melee. So we're going to keep struggling. We're going to keep trying to recruit Ranged DPS, which, by the way, if you are a good Ranged DPS, please do check out my guild, Nexus, on Uldaman. It is lots of fun. We raid Thursdays and Mondays, so definitely give us a whisper, hit us up, check us out. We're looking for Ranged DPS. We're progressing through Heroic right now. We need Ranged DPS, but everybody does, so that's your answer. That's why they don't exist. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you like it, be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. Also be sure to subscribe and click the bell to make sure you don't miss out on any of my future videos. I do World of Warcraft content every 2 weeks, sometimes more often, sometimes extra stuff as well. So thanks again for watching. I'm Ian from Sleep Deprivation, dozing off, and I'll catch you guys in the next video when I wake up.